In 2004, movie actor and producer Mel Gibson released a film called The Passion of the Christ. It cost $30 million to produce, then another $15 million to market it. But at the box office, it resulted in $612 million in sales. That's not a bad profit margin. I'm curious, how many of you have seen The Passion of the Christ? How many? Raise your hands. Okay, most people, I think. Okay. Curious, how many of you that raised your hand saw that movie when it first came out in the theater? How many of you saw that? You saw it in the theater. Okay, good. The version of the movie that is now available on a limited basis, there's a timeline on this. The movie that is now available on Amazon Prime, Netflix, Pureflix, that movie is a shorter version of that original film that was in the theaters. 6 minutes of that original film were cut to lessen some of the more intense violence. We were pastoring in Northern California at the time, and we purchased the exclusive use of a large theater, the largest one we could find, and we purchased the exclusive use of that theater for 2 consecutive nights. And both nights were completely packed. So I watched the original movie twice. And if I remember correctly, the scourging lasted 11 minutes and consisted of some 100 brutal lashes. It was so intense, I had to close my eyes for parts of that. The recut version of the movie removed some of that scourging to lessen the violence. The Passion of the Christ primarily covers the last 12 hours of Jesus' life. And this miniature series we're starting this morning covers that same 12 hours. This is found in Matthew 26, and we're going to start at verse 1 in a moment. Justice is an often mentioned subject in the media. And because of television cameras positioned inside courtrooms and countless reporters stationed outside courtrooms, it is becoming more and more apparent that the judicial system does not always function as it should. Instead of justice, sometimes there's injustice. One high-profile example of that was a Chicago grand jury indicted this entitled actor, Jussie Smollett, indicted him on 16 felonies related to his staging an alleged hate crime hoax. Most of us are aware of that. So after being indicted for some unknown reason, Cook County prosecutors suddenly dropped all charges. That infuriated the Chicago Police Department, in addition to former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who called that decision, quote, a whitewash of justice. And most people suspect it was. Even the best judges and juries sometimes convict the innocent and exonerate the guilty. The more recent use of DNA evidence has determined that hundreds of convicted felons are actually innocent of the charges brought against them, and in some cases that irrefutable evidence has been used to rescue someone just hours before a scheduled execution. Human courts seem to have an uncanny knack for turning justice completely on its head. But the greatest historic example of human injustice was the conviction and death sentence of Jesus Christ. Nothing else compares. The judicial process that resulted in Jesus' death is a classic example of an unfair and illegal rush to judgment. The individual legal assessments that Jesus endured represent the absolute worst moments in the entire record of human jurisprudence. I mentioned this past time that some people find history boring, but this should be an exception to that. This is extremely important. Starting at verse 1. Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, verse 2, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man is Jesus." In Scripture, Jesus is called the Son of David, meaning a descendant from David, the Son of Mary, his mother, the Son of God, and the Son of Man. And so the Son of Man, Jesus, will be delivered up to be crucified. Now, in Matthew's chapter 24 and 25, Jesus has taught what is most often called the Olivet Discourse. And it is called that because he sat on the Mount of Olives as he spoke. The Olivet Discourse was a private sermon from Jesus to his disciples that discussed the prophetic destruction of Jerusalem and the actual end of this age. And that message is extremely relevant to us today. In fact, I hope to be able to go through that sometime soon. But here in verse 1, that sermon had ended. In a chronological sense, it was now in the middle of what we call Passion Week. In a chronological sense, Passion Week starts on Palm Sunday. On Palm Sunday, commemorating Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem carried on a donkey. So that's the beginning of Passion Week. It continues through Wednesday. Wednesday is called Spy Wednesday. That is an unusual name, but it is said that Judas Iscariot, in secret, spoke to the authorities about arresting Jesus. So it is called Spy Wednesday. Then there is Maundy Thursday. Maundy Thursday commemorated the time Jesus washed his disciples' feet, and in the evening hours where Jesus was arrested that night. And then Good Friday commemorates Jesus' crucifixion. Holy Saturday commemorates Jesus still buried in the tomb. And then Passion Week ends on Easter Sunday morning, commemorating Jesus' literal resurrection from the dead. And that all happens during Passion Week. So this is during Passion Week. Jesus had announced to his disciples that he was going to die. And he announced he would die at the beginning of the Passover celebration. The most significant religious feast the Jewish people celebrated was Passover. Literally thousands and thousands of Jewish pilgrims from other regions and other countries journeyed to Jerusalem each spring to celebrate Passover. And Passover is still celebrated. Passover in 2026 starts on Thursday, April 2nd, and ends on Thursday, April 9th. It is extremely important to remember that Jesus died according to a precise timetable. And according to that divine schedule, the most appropriate time for Jesus to die was during Passover season. And there's a reason for that. More than 265,000, imagine, 265,000 lambs were sacrificed at the Jerusalem temple during Passover. The priests were basically butchers soaked in sacrificial blood. Jesus was scheduled to die at the precise time those Passover lambs were being slaughtered because Jesus himself was the ultimate and perfect human sacrificial Passover lamb. So that was the specific connection to Passover. Verse 3, "Then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas." Now, his full name was Joseph Caiaphas, and he was a Roman government appointed high priest. That sounds strange, but remember, Israel was not a sovereign nation at this time, because the Roman Empire occupied Palestine. So Rome did hold some authoritative rule over the Jewish nation. And because of that, it had interrupted Jewish tradition and had started appointing different high priests to serve the people. Caiaphas had been given a government appointment from Rome to serve as the Jewish high priest. Caiaphas was also a member of the Jewish sect called the Sadducees, and he was a religious liberal. Caiaphas had an infamous father-in-law named Annas. I might add, these pictures are from the movie Passion of the Christ. Annas had been a former high priest himself, but he was such a despicable person, the Roman government removed him from office in 15 AD, and then in 18 AD appointed Caiaphas as his successor. But behind the scenes, the former high priest Annas continued to exert his evil influence on the nation through his son-in-law, Caiaphas. So much so that the office amounted to a joint high priest arrangement. Both Annas and Caiaphas acted as high priest. People have debated this for centuries. The question and who was actually responsible for the murder of Jesus, who did it, who should we blame? Former television commentator Bill O'Reilly, that name should sound familiar, he has co-authored a series of best-selling books. Those titles are interesting. His first book, called Killing Lincoln, then Killing Kennedy, then Killing Patton, then Killing Reagan, then Killing Killers, meaning terrorists, and others. Altogether, Bill O'Reilly has offered 13 killing books. And I'm guessing after his dies, his co-author is going to publish Killing O'Reilly. I think that's probably what's going to happen. But in 2013, he authored Killing Jesus. I read that particular publication from beginning to end, and Mr. Riley blamed the murder of Jesus on the Roman government because he said that Jesus interfered with the Roman taxation system. O'Reilly was mistaken. That's not exactly what happened. From a historical perspective, the legal process started at the Jewish high priest, Caiaphas. And from a spiritual perspective, it ended at us because we're all culpable. We're all complicit in Jesus' death. Because of our sin, we murdered Jesus on a cross. But in a historical sense, it started at Caiaphas, because he organized the plot to arrest Jesus. He got the chief priests, elders, and scribes together to do that. Scribes essentially copied Scripture and became attorneys who also interpreted the Scripture, those parts related to the Mosaic Law. Now notice it wasn't a representative from the Roman government that started this process. It was the Jewish high priest, Caiaphas, that set in motion this illegal process and then masterminded the scheme to arrest Jesus and execute him. Verse 4, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. It's interesting that each time Jesus' enemies tried to use logic or argumentation to get him to incriminate himself or catch him in an arrestable position, he confused them and left them speechless. That's found in Matthew 22, verse 46. The religious authorities also understood that they couldn't forcibly arrest Jesus themselves because the common people would resist that. That's Matthew 21, verse 46. Verse 5, but they said, again, these men are deliberating among themselves exactly what to do, but they said, not during the feast. These religious authorities congregating together, plotting the arrest of Jesus, said, let's not arrest Jesus during the Passover celebration. Now, why would that be? Read on. Lest there be an uproar among the people. The reasoning was that if Jesus were arrested during the Passover, that because there was such a large number of people sympathetic to him, it might cause a riot and a disturbance in Jerusalem. Let me explain how the jurisprudence system was structured in ancient Israel. The Jewish people prided themselves on a sense of fairness and justice. And so to enact fair judicial procedures, the nation determined that any Jewish community that had a minimum of 120 heads of families could form a legal council. That local legal council was called the Sanhedrin. And the word Sanhedrin meant a sitting together. So a Sanhedrin consisted of men. No women were permitted on that council. A Sanhedrin consisted of selected men that sat together to conduct legal proceedings. Each local Sanhedrin consisted of only 23 members. But there was also a Sanhedrin located in Jerusalem called the Great Sanhedrin that had 71 members. The Great Sanhedrin consisted of 24 chief priests and 46 elders, elders meaning older, mature men, 24 chief priests and 46 elders, and those were also selected from the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees. And remember, all of those groups were opposed to Jesus. 24 and 46 equals 70. And since there were 71 total members on this final, on the Sanhedrin, the final member and moderator of the Great Sanhedrin was the reigning high priest himself, which would have been Caiaphas. Now notice that both the smaller Sanhedrin in local communities and the great Jerusalem Sanhedrin had an odd number of members, 23 and 71, so that there could never be a tie vote. This great Sanhedrin acted as Israel's supreme court. The chief priests, scribes, and elders mentioned here were members of this great Jerusalem Sanhedrin. And these men were meeting together in secret with the high priest Caiaphas. Historians have said Caiaphas was a treacherous and deceitful man that was totally antagonistic to Jesus. But his hatred of Jesus was probably more political than theological. Caiaphas wanted to eliminate Jesus because he felt that Jesus, as the supposed promised Messiah, might be a threat to his position as high priest and a threat to the authority over the Jewish people that he held. He didn't want what he perceived to be competition from Jesus. He was driven from greed and selfish ambition and had no regard for justice or people except that which could be used to his personal advantage. Caiaphas was the epitome of decadent religious system of his time. And notice that he met with these representatives from the Great Sanhedrin to specifically plot the arrest of Jesus. Jesus was immensely popular with a large segment of the common people, so the authorities' plan was to arrest Jesus in secret at a time other than during the Passover celebration. That was the plan, so as not to antagonize the multitudes of people that still admired him. Jerusalem's population more than doubled at Passover as these pilgrims from other regions, other countries, migrated there to celebrate this religious feast. And so these men that are plotting his arrest felt it would be safer to wait until the Passover crowds had returned home and things had quieted down some, and then arrest Jesus. But in spite of that precaution, this is interesting. When Jesus' enemies did ultimately arrest and execute him, it was at the exact time that the religious authorities had wanted to avoid. The Passover season was the time God himself had selected for Jesus to die, since he was the ultimate Passover sacrificial lamb, but it was the specific time the Jewish religious authorities wanted to avoid. It's interesting that after all the different times his enemies tried to kill him and couldn't, now his enemies tried to postpone his death until after Passover and also couldn't. And it was because these evil men ultimately crucified Jesus according to God's schedule and not their own. And that is evidence that God is sovereign, God is in charge, and we aren't. This might sound strange and bizarre on the surface, but God himself premeditated, orchestrated, arranged, and facilitated the precise murder of his son. Verse 14, then one of the 12 apostles, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest. Verse 15, and said, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. Verse 16, so from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. Judas Iscariot negotiated a contract to help the authorities arrest Jesus. He negotiated a fee of 30 pieces of silver to hand over Jesus to the temple elite. That amount equaled the cost of an average slave. So Judas sold out Jesus for basically what it cost to purchase a common slave. That's partly the reason Jesus said in verse 24 that it would have been better that Judas had never been born. And that's also the reason that most of us have never met someone named Judas. I read that there was once a law in Germany that no parent could name his child Judas. And that's understandable. Then starting at verse 17, Jesus instructed his disciples to prepare to eat the Passover meal together. And at that special meal, Jesus predicted one of his own disciples would betray him. But no one at that table suspected it could be Judas. No one. He was the ultimate fraud, the ultimate counterfeit, the ultimate hypocrite. After that meal, Jesus and the disciples then went out from the upper room in Jerusalem to the Mountain of Olives. Verse 36, then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. Verse 37, and he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee. The sons of Zebedee are James and John, who were two of the apostles. The name Gethsemane means olive press. And the Garden of Gethsemane was located at the base of the Mountain of Olives, just east of Jerusalem. This garden called Gethsemane was often loaned to Jesus and his disciples to use as a place to retreat and pray. It is probable that this garden was fenced or walled off and had just a singular entrance or a gate. Jesus asked some of his disciples to sit at the garden's entrance and stop anyone from coming into the garden so as not to disturb him as he prayed. But then he brought his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, inside the garden. The rest of this verse reads, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Verse 38, then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. I'm just looking at anybody. Figure out who that was. Anyway, okay. It can happen. It does happen. Question. Why was Jesus so grieved and saddened almost to the point of death? It is entirely possible to die from sadness. People have actually grieved themselves to death because sadness is such a strong emotion. And the emotional trauma Jesus felt was so severe, it probably would have destroyed him, except that God had scheduled him to die on a cross instead of in the garden. Luke's gospel account teaches that the emotional torture of grief Jesus felt in the garden caused him to sweat great drops of blood. Luke 22, verse 44. Notice, and being in agony, this is Jesus in the garden, late at night, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Now, some people believe this statement we just read is describing an extremely rare medical condition called hematotrosis. Hematotrosis. It is said that around someone's sweat glands, there are small capillaries arranged in a net-like form. Under unusual emotional stress and or grief, the subcutaneous capillaries containing blood dilate, meaning enlarge, until those capillaries burst open. This means that the ruptured blood then mixes with the perspiration from the sweat glands, and this bloodied sweat comes to the surface of the skin. It is possible Jesus experienced this incredible phenomena, hematotrosis, as a result of his intense spiritual torment. He is so grieved. That begs the question, do our attitudes, actions, and reactions cause Jesus to smile? Or do we cause him sadness and grief? Do we please him, or are we a disappointment to him? And I admit, I have disappointed him multiple times. Verse 39, he went a little further, this is Jesus, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The reason Jesus felt so much agonizing emotional trauma was not that he dreaded the crucifixion, but because he was repulsed at being made to suffer for our sins. Notice the statement, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Now, don't misunderstand this cup. This cup didn't represent death. This cup wasn't the painfulness of the cross, and it was agonizing. This cup wasn't the scourging or the humiliation. It wasn't the horrible thirst or the torture of the nails or the disgrace of being spat on and beaten. It wasn't even a combination of all those things. In the Old Testament, divine judgment on sin was often described as a cup to be drunk. Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah 27, Lamentations 4, Ezekiel 23, and Habakkuk 2. The cup Jesus referred to in this prayer, in this statement, represented the judgment of God on all the sin Jesus would be required to endure on the cross. Jesus prayed that if it were possible, this assigned cup might pass from him. Jesus was speaking about drinking the cup of judgment from God on all the sin Jesus would be required to endure on the cross. Jesus prayed that if possible, this assigned cup might pass. Jesus was speaking about drinking the cup of divine judgment. It was not that Jesus was afraid to die. He wasn't. It wasn't that he wanted to option out of the crucifixion. He didn't. But because he had never sinned, not once, Jesus didn't want to take onto himself our sin and suffer the judgment from God on those sins. If there was another solution to man's sin problem. If there was a plan B, Jesus wanted that instead, if he could avoid having to bear the sins of humankind. But notice there was no other means to secure forgiveness and salvation. The solution to our sin problem was an innocent substitute taking our sins onto himself and then being sacrificed and subjected to judgment from God on those sins. And Jesus was literally the only human being that qualified to be that substitute. If there had been another solution to securing salvation, such as just being a good person in a comparative sense, or just being religious, then God wouldn't have scheduled Jesus to die. But there was no alternative solution to man's sin. So the cup could not and did not pass from him. But Jesus said he would do what his Father God wanted, even if it meant to drink that cup of judgment. And he did. Verse 40, then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" Verse 41, watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus got up from praying in the garden and found his 3 disciples asleep, Peter, James, and John. It was midnight or after when Jesus and his disciples arrived at the garden, so these men were probably tired. But that's not an acceptable excuse to sleep on Jesus. I contend the disciples didn't take this situation serious enough. Why would I say that? Jesus had predicted his death. He had spoken to them about his death. But it seems the disciples didn't fully understand that or didn't accept that, because if they would have, if they fully understood Jesus is about to die, their minds and emotions would have been too adrenaline driven to be able to sleep. But even after being told to watch and pray, these disciples fell asleep again. Verse 42, again, a second time, he, Jesus, went away and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." Verse 43, and he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. Verse 44, so he left them, went away again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Please notice that this symbolic cup Jesus did not want to drink from was such a huge issue to him that he prayed the same basic prayer 3 different times. He essentially says, God, isn't there a plan B? I just don't want to be made sin and suffer for sin. Is there some other way? And there wasn't. Verse 45, then he came to his disciples and said to them, are you sleeping? Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man himself is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Verse 46, rise, meaning get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Verse 47, and while he was still speaking, behold, Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. This multitude that came to the garden to arrest Jesus included officers from the Jerusalem temple that had been granted limited police powers from the Roman government. This multitude also included a cohort of Roman soldiers, and a cohort at full strength consisted of 600 men. Because the Roman Empire ruled the Jewish state at this time, only the Roman government had the authority to execute someone, and that's the reason the Jewish authorities requested Roman soldiers to join them in this arrest. Notice both the soldiers from Fort Antonia in Jerusalem and the temple police carried swords and clubs in addition to lighted torches and lanterns to assist them in finding Jesus in the darkness. One commentator said that the total number of men that came to arrest Jesus that night could have been as much as 1,000. 1,000 men commissioned to arrest one innocent and nonviolent man. The religious authorities did anticipate some resistance from Jesus and the disciples, but 1,000 men was over the top. Verse 48, now his betrayer, Judas Iscariot, had given them a sign saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him. Verse 49, immediately he went up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi. Rabbi means teacher. Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Judas could have used another form of touch in identifying Jesus. He could have walked up to him, placed his hand on his shoulder. He could have hugged him. But Judas' decision to kiss Jesus was probably the most hypocritical and treacherous sign he could have used. In ancient societies, the kiss was considered a common form of greeting and a sign of affection. To embrace and kiss someone on the cheek was supposed to be a sign of close affection. But the affectionate kiss Judas pretended to demonstrate toward Jesus was fraudulent. It was a sham, used only to direct the multitude in the darkness to just which man to arrest. In modern times, we still use the phrase, a Judas kiss. A Judas kiss is an act of apparent friendship that turns out to be harmful to the recipient of that act. Example, someone who pretends to care about us, someone who befriends us, and then stabs us in the back is guilty of a Judas kiss. Verse 50, but Jesus said to him, Judas, friend, why have you come? Jesus called Judas friend, but he didn't use the word most often used to indicate friend. It might better be translated as companion or comrade. Jesus fully understood that Judas was not, and Judas had never been, a true friend to him. Verse 50 continues, then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. Verse 51, and suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. Verse 52, but Jesus said to him, put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Now, John's gospel informs us that it was Simon Peter that pulled out his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. That priest's servant was named Malchus. So Peter, as usual, overreacted. I'm sure he intended to remove his head, and Malchus ducked, so he only cut off his ear. Unlike the teachings of Islam under Sharia law, the church is not supposed to advance its cause through actual physical warfare. There is no such thing as holy wars. Some Islamic jihadists argue that terrorism is revenge for what Christians did to the Muslims during the Crusades. The Crusades happened from 1095 AD to 1230 AD. In a technical sense, the Crusades were attempts to reclaim land Muslims had conquered from Christians. From 200 AD to 900 AD, the land that is now Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Turkey were inhabited by Christians. But Muslims invaded those lands, oppressed, enslaved, deported, or murdered the Christians there. But then Roman Catholicism stepped up, and then supposed Christian kings and emperors from Europe ordered the Crusades to reclaim the land the Muslims had taken. But the terminology Christian Crusades is a misnomer, because most participants in those crusades were Christian in name only. And those battles were utterly unholy and barbaric, murdering non-combatants, forcing people to convert to Christianity or die. The Crusaders' actions contradicted and undermined everything that Jesus represented. That's the reason Luke's gospel mentions that Jesus reached down, picked up the severed ear, and attached it onto Malchus's head. I wish I had a video of that. That would be amazing. And then after he reattached the ear on Malchus's head, he instructed Peter to put away his sword. Then Jesus said in the second part of verse 52, all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Don't misunderstand that statement. That statement is not necessarily teaching that someone who uses violence is himself going to die from violence, even though that is sometimes possible, as in the case of inner city gang warfare and drug cartels competing for dominance. It does happen often. But the sword mentioned here represented government execution, because Roman government often beheaded someone as a form of execution. It was a common form. Paul himself was decapitated. So don't miss this. The principle Jesus stated is that people that commit acts of violence to achieve personal ends are susceptible to capital punishment and execution from the civil authorities. No matter how unjust the arrest of Jesus was, Simon Peter had no right to take vigilante action. And if Peter had killed Malchus, then Jesus understood the Roman authorities had the legal right to execute him. In discouraging Simon Peter from using the sword, Jesus was not talking about self-defense or defending someone else, because self-defense is a biblical concept, but Jesus was discouraging taking justice into our own hands, which is what Simon Peter tried to do. Verse 53, or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, God the Father in heaven, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels. Verse 54, how then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus? In a technical sense, Jesus didn't need Simon Peter to defend him. He could have defended himself if he wanted to. He could have called down from heaven 12 legions of angels to rescue him. Remember, one full Roman legion consisted of 6,000 soldiers. So 12 legions times 6,000 angels in a legion equals 72,000 angels. To demonstrate the significant strength of 72,000 angels, consider that one angel, just one angel from the Old Testament, in one night, acting alone, massacred 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. One angel, 185,000 dead soldiers. So the devastating force of 72,000 angels is unimaginable. Jesus had access to supernatural forces that could have destroyed not just the Roman cohort assigned to arrest him, but he could have completely wiped out the entire Roman Empire itself. The point is, Jesus did not have to die. He died because God the Father predetermined that he should die as the singular solution to man's sin problem. Verse 55, in that hour, Jesus said to the multitudes, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. Verse 56, but all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. No matter what this crowd's personal reasons and motivations might have been, these people were doing exactly what the Old Testament messianic prophecies said would happen to Jesus. These men are fulfilling prophecy. Verse 57, and those who laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Verse 58, but Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard. Notice, Peter followed Jesus to see the high priest, but he followed him at a distance. Why? Because Simon Peter is at this moment a complete coward. And he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. It is said that Jesus was brought from the garden to see Caiaphas, the high priest, so that he might be tried there. But there are some gaps in this account. So let me explain this. In a technical sense, the night before his crucifixion, this is Thursday night, after the Passover supper, and this after his prayer in the garden and his arrest, Jesus faced two major trials. One was Jewish and religious, and one was Roman and secular. Don't forget that. All night he stood at two trials, one Jewish and religious, and the second one Roman and secular. But it is important to understand that there were three separate phases to each of those two trials. That meant in a period of just hours throughout the night, Jesus faced legal proceedings a total of 6 separate times. And then afterwards in the morning, he was crucified. The first phase to the religious proceedings consisted of Jesus meeting Annas. The second phase was Jesus facing Caiaphas. And the third phase was Jesus being interrogated in front of the high court called the Great Sanhedrin. So the chronological order to this first religious courtroom proceedings was Annas, Caiaphas, and then the Great Sanhedrin. Don't forget that. Annas, Caiaphas, and the Great Sanhedrin. This first phase, to see Annas, was an unauthorized inquisition at the residence of the former high priest Annas, probably around 2 a.m. Remember, Annas was not acting not the acting high priest, but he was still referred to as high priest, and still exercised great influence in the Jerusalem religious activities. Annas had managed to turn the high priesthood into a lucrative business, not unlike some modern televangelists do. Annas instituted a system of collecting license fees and commissions from the brokers who changed money into temple currency and sold sacrificial animals on the temple grounds. The entire business was a total racket and was the reason Jesus drove the money changers and animal traders out of the temple, and he did it twice. Jesus represented a real threat to Annas' business interests, and so he wanted him eliminated. But since he wasn't able to actually find a charge to pin on Jesus, he had Jesus sent to the next then current high priest, Caiaphas. That second phase was the meeting at the house of Caiaphas at about 3 a.m. And that is described in verses 57 through 68. We're going to save that for next time, but let me set up this section. I find this incredibly interesting. The general requirements of fairness and impartial judgment prescribed in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 16, was made evident in the rabbinical requirements that guaranteed an accused criminal the right to a public trial and the right to defense counsel, but only if it was based on the testimony of at least 2 reliable witnesses. In order to guard against someone bringing a false accusation against a defendant, the Mosaic statute prescribed that the person that knowingly shared a false testimony about the defendant would suffer, if caught, the same punishment the accuser would suffer if he were found guilty. That tended to cause someone to think twice about bringing a false accusation against someone, because if he got caught, then he would get the same punishment he wanted for the defendant to get. That could be torture, that could be imprisonment, and that could mean death. Also, rabbinical law required that a sentence of death could not be carried out until the 3rd day after it was rendered, and that during that interim day, the members of the court were supposed to fast, not eat. That mandated delay of execution provided additional time for more evidence or more testimonies to be discovered on the defendant's behalf. Simon Greenleaf was a famous 19th century professor of law at Harvard University. Simon Greenleaf died 1853. He was one of the most celebrated legal minds in American history, with one of his works entitled Treatise on the Law of Evidence, still being considered now the greatest single authority on evidence in the entire literature of legal procedure. Now, Simon Greenleaf had been an atheist. He said that the resurrection of Jesus was a legend. Some Christian students challenged him to investigate his claim. So Simon Greenleaf tried to disprove Jesus' resurrection using his own rules of evidence, but he couldn't, so he became a sincere Christian and is considered now one of the most important figures in the development of Christian apologetics, specifically legal apologetics. Simon Greenleaf, in his book, The Testimony of the Evangelist, a section written by attorney Joseph Salvador, describes proper Sanhedrin trial procedure. And this is, to me, fascinating. On the day of the trial, according to Salvador, the court officers would require all evidence against the accused person to be read in the full hearing of an open court. So all the evidence that had been accumulated against the accused person would be read in public in an open court. Each witness against him would be required to affirm that his testimony was true to the best of his knowledge and was based on his own direct experience and not based on hearsay or presumption. These witnesses also had to do, this is incredible, these witnesses that are they're participating in the charges against the defendant, these witnesses had to identify the precise month, the precise day, the precise hour, and the precise location of the event about which they testify. The council itself, the Sanhedrin, could not initiate charges against a person, but could only consider charges brought before it by an outside party. There was always to be a presumption of innocence, and great latitude was given the accused in presenting his defense. Now, in local, smaller Sanhedrin councils, 11 votes out of the total 23 were required to acquit someone, but 13 votes were required for conviction. If the accused was found innocent, he was freed immediately. But if he was found guilty, the sentence was not pronounced and enacted until 2 days afterwards. And as we mentioned earlier, the council members were required to adjourn to their homes during that time and fast. Fast, the day between the hearings and the pronouncement and execution. On the morning of the third day, the council was reconvened, and each judge in turn was asked if he had changed his decision. It is said that a guilty vote could be changed to not guilty, but not the reverse. A non-guilty vote couldn't be changed to guilty. If a guilty verdict was reaffirmed, an officer with a flag remained near the council as another officer mounted on horseback escorting the prisoner to the place of execution. And then someone acting as a herald went before this slow-moving procession, declaring in a loud voice, "This man," and he named the guilty person, "this man is led to punishment for such a crime," and he named the crime. "The witnesses who have sworn against him are such and such persons," and he named the witnesses. "If anyone has evidence to give in his favor, let him come forth quickly." If at any time before the sentence was actually carried out, if additional information pertaining to innocence was made available, including the prisoner's own recollection of something he had forgotten in his testimony, one officer would signal the other officer, and the prisoner would be brought back to the Sanhedrin Council for reconsideration of the verdict. Before the place of execution was reached, the condemned person was urged to confess his crime if he had not already done so, and then he would be given a narcotic drink to dull his sentence and make his death less painful. The governing principle in all capital cases was that if possible, the Sanhedrin was to save human life, not destroy it. In addition to the provision I just described, the president of the Sanhedrin, being Caiaphas in this case, was required to remind prospective witnesses of the preciousness of human life and to admonish them to be absolutely certain that their testimony was both true and complete. No criminal trial could begin at night. No criminal trial could be continued into the night. It is said that voting was done from the youngest member of the Sanhedrin to the oldest member in order that the least experienced members did not feel undue pressure from those members that had been on the council the longest. Now, this next part sounds crazy to me. If the Sanhedrin voted unanimously to convict someone, meaning if all 71 members voted to convict someone, sentence them to death, if it was unanimous, then the accused was set free. What does that mean? If the vote was unanimous that he should die, why would he be set free? Because, according to Jewish jurisprudence, a unanimous decision meant that the element of mercy was not a part of the decision. This ancient Old Testament legal system, as prescribed in the Mosaic Code, is actually the basis for our own judicial system. It was extremely good, extremely fair. It is apparent that the Jewish system of justice was designed to be not only fair but merciful, but it is just as obvious that the system did not operate in a fair and merciful sense in the case of Jesus. Because the great Sanhedrin council violated virtually every principle of its own system of jurisprudence. Jesus was illegally tried without first having been charged with a crime. He was tried at night and all night, and he was tried in private. No defense was permitted to represent him, and the witnesses brought against him had been bribed to falsify their testimonies. He was executed on the same day he was sentenced, and consequently, the judges on the council did not fast on the interim day that should have transpired and didn't. So these men had no opportunity to even reconsider their verdict. Those entire legal proceedings were a complete sham. It was the ultimate kangaroo court. It was a miscarriage of justice. But it gets worse. Much, much, much worse, as we are going to see. An Anglican bishop made this statement: if you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have chosen the side of the oppressors. That same principle applies to the injustices committed against Jesus. If you are neutral about Jesus, then you have chosen the side of his ancient accusers. And this modern day neutrality is not acceptable. Straddling the fence is not possible. Refusing to formulate an opinion is not optional. You must decide what you want to do with Jesus. And I only hope and pray that you make the right decision. Let's bow our heads for a moment. Father, thank you for this lesson. I know it's kind of technical, I get that. But I hope we better understand all that Jesus went through. And we're going to discuss more of that next time. But I pray, God, that this will be a very powerful series for us, that we will be reminded of the horrors of the crucifixion and all that Jesus endured and the illegality of it all. So thank you for your word, and I pray that we won't forget these things. We'll take them with us when we leave.